excited for At the Movies? Are you guys stoked for this? I can't wait. Today I'm preaching out of Hidden Figures, which is going to be, let me see a show of hands. Who's seen Hidden Figures? Has anyone seen? Okay, good. Okay, I love this movie. I connect with this movie in such a great way. If you're not familiar with it, maybe you've seen it a while ago, let me refresh your memory or bring you up to speed on this video. There are 3 African-American women who are called to do math at NASA, and they work at NASA in the middle of a time in America's history where it's a time of segregation, and it's also a time where women have no respect nor rights. So they have these 2 things coming against them, that they are genuinely the most brilliant people that NASA has. But because of the color of their skin and because of their gender, everything is coming against them. And so through this movie, we kind of navigate with them as they walk, and people begin to speak to them and begin to call them things, or begin to say, well, you can't do this, or there's no protocol for women to do that. And there's all these different things, and we really journey with them. I love it because they're underdogs. I love an underdog story. Like, I just think those kinds of stories are so great. They're based on a real life story, which I think is so powerful. But let me tell you this, and before I get into today, we're going to kind of camp out in Exodus with the story of Moses. But let me just encourage you with this. I love this movie too because of the strong will in these women. And I'm all about strong will. I believe that you should channel a will, not crush a will. And I want to encourage you with that, and I said the same thing to the first experience. If you're a parent, maybe you work with the next generation, maybe, I don't know what your interaction may be, can I encourage you to channel strong will, not challenge strong will? I think sometimes strong will can be looked at something and we're like, oh, they're so defiant, oh, whatever. You know, we laugh about this because Elijah and I are both firstborn children, so we are by nature like, here we go, we're doing this. We're like strong-willed to the max. And then you put 2 strong-willed people together, and we have 2 kids, and they are massively strong-willed, okay? And they give us a run for our money on a daily basis. Not in a defiant, not in a disrespectful way, but Ane generally thinks she can do something, and it does not make sense to her why she can't do it. Or Zion's like, you know, when Zion saw, heard me talking about Hidden Figures, he hasn't seen it, but he heard me talking about it, and the women who did math and stuff, he was like, well, I'm really good at math, so I could probably work at NASA too. I was like, you probably could. And now he's like, can read and everything, so he's like, and I'm an adult, so I might do it really soon. I was like, well, you do that then, Zion. You go for it. But can I tell you, please be praying. And I would encourage you, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're working with the next generation, channel strong will. Don't crush strong will. Because if you channel strong will, those strong-willed individuals, the next generation, I believe they will change the world as we know it. They need a healthy backbone to be respectful, but to say, no, don't tell me I can't do that because it's not been done. Don't tell me that I can't dream that big because I can go farther. Okay, so that's my plug for strong will, for Hidden Figures. But before we get into this movie, the first scene of Hidden Figures begins us with one of the main characters, Catherine. And she is a genius mathematician, and she's a child. And they hand Catherine a piece of chalk. So if you would turn your eyes to the screen and check out this first scene from Hidden Figures. What's in your hand? My first question for you today, and I want to talk to you today if you're taking notes. You can title it, What's in Your Hand? And my first question for you is simply that. What is in your hand? In this first scene, they zoom in on Catherine being given a piece of chalk. And I never really picked up the significance of that. I appreciate good videos because of, you know, our creative team, and they're amazing. But I didn't really appreciate that shot until I watched this movie over and over again. And to be totally honest, I'm like slightly obsessed with this movie. I like to call this sermon research, just like I did for The Greatest Showman. But I was watching this movie over and over again, and they continually zoom in on the piece of chalk that's been given to Catherine. And, you know, it brought me back to Elijah a couple years ago when God gave us this vision to launch change and to see a city transformed. I was like, Elijah, how are we going to do this? Like, what does that look like? Like, where do we even start? I have no idea. And Elijah was like, I don't know, but God just asked me, what's in your hand? And I was like, okay, so what's in our hand? Like, I was like, what is it? Can you tell me? And he was like, I think right now it's a video camera. And I was like, oh, okay. So what are we going to do with that? Like, I was like, okay, like, this is so exciting. Let me in on it. And I can't tell you enough how much God has provided and the doors he's opened and the opportunities he's given and the people that have been reached and the training that we've been able to receive because Elijah was faithful with what was in his hand. It brought me back to the story of Moses in Exodus 4. And we pick up this story with Moses, where God is telling Moses that he's going to go to Pharaoh. The Israelites, God's people, had been in captivity for all this time. And God calls Moses to meet him at a burning bush. And God says to Moses, now I'm going to use you to go to Pharaoh, who is now the most powerful man in the world. I'm going to use you to go to Pharaoh and bring my people out of captivity into freedom. And Moses, this is where we pick up. So God's just said that to Moses, and we're going to pick up in Exodus 4, 1 through 5. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. What's in your hand? You know, I read that story time and time again, and I think my favorite line was always, what is that in your hand? But as I was studying and I was praying for today, God so strongly said to me, but Moses had to lay it down before it was something that God could use. You know, I think that we all have something in our hand. We're all holding something. And you may be like, I don't know what I have in my hand. Listen, it may be one of your traits of your personality. It may be a skill that God has given you. It may be something that he's put you in the midst of. It may be something that you've learned. I don't know what's in your hand, but I know whatever God's put in our hand is what he's going to use to bring provision, to see miracles happen, to see freedom for those around us. You see, Moses' staff, at the time, a staff, if you will, it basically represented like a means of provision, right? Because shepherds use their staff with their sheep. And so it's their farming, it's their herding, it's everything that they're doing for provision. It also represented safety, right? Anything comes, like you can fight it off, whatever. They use staffs for everything. But God used the staff, once Moses laid it down and he picked it up, God used this staff to provide miracle after miracle, provision after provision, deliverance after deliverance, guidance after guidance. God used the staff that was in Moses' hand. It actually came to be the staff of God, not Moses' staff. Once he laid it down and picked it back up, it became the staff of God that led the Israelites. You know, then we keep following the story, and they show up to the Red Sea, and they got the army coming behind them, and they have the sea in front of them. Anyone ever felt trapped sometime in your life? You're like, all right, I'm coming from that, and I'm going towards this, and this is a problem. Anyone ever felt that way in life? But you know, God always provides you with what you need for a means of out, an escape. He always provides you with what is in your hand. You know, I would encourage you this week as you leave this place to pray through what God's put in your hand. What has he equipped you with? What has he given you? Because it'll be exactly what you need to accomplish exactly what he's called you to accomplish. As we keep following the Hidden Figures movie, the second scene that I want to show you is from one of the other characters. Her name is Mary. And one of the other characters shows up on the scene, and she's had this dream to be an engineer. But like we talked about at that time, because of her gender and color of her skin, she didn't have the opportunity to pursue what she needed to pursue or to get the education that she needed to get or to really dream beyond where she was. That was an inconceivable idea in that time. So if you would check out the second scene from Hidden Figures on the screens. Listen, just as important as the first question, what's in your hand, is the second question, who are you with? You know, she had been working with this gentleman, and in the time, she's like, I can't dream that. I can't do that. That's impossible for me where I'm at and what I'm doing. And he says, but look at me. I'm a Polish Jew whose parents were killed in the Nazi camps. Like, look at who I was and look at where I am. I think we're living a miracle. If we continue following the story of Moses as he's leading the Israelites, if you'll pick up with me in Exodus 16, verse 33, and this is the time when the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness, right? And they're like, Moses, now we're hungry. I mean, can you imagine leading millions of complaining people? Like, that could give me anxiety just thinking of it, because I don't do complaining well, but I can't imagine. So the Israelites are like, Moses, we don't have any food. What are we going to do next? What's going to happen? And God's like, all right, I'll provide manna. So he begins to provide manna, right? And manna comes every day from God, and it was the food that sustained the Israelites on this journey. And in chapter 16, verse 33, it says, so Moses said to Aaron, take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come. You see, it's this picture of taking a jar and putting the manna, the miracle that they had experienced, in it to be kept and shared for generations to come. Elijah, his family grew up like this. His parents had a manna jar. And it was just a big, I think it was like just a glass, like a big pickle jar, or like something like that, like just a big glass jar, just whatever, took it off. And it was just full of anything that represented miracles in their life. It may have been something when they were traveling on the road. It was something from the hospital when Elijah was young, a little child. He had nodules on his vocal cords. And the doctors told Elijah's parents, that he would never be able to sing. Potentially he would be able to speak, but he would never be able to sing. He's never going to be able to yell. He'll never be able to shout, which we all know that's not the case. But he was healed, and it was an absolute miracle of God. And so they put something in there that would represent that. And so for when Elijah and I first got married, Elijah said, okay, let's go get a glass jar, and we're going to begin our manna jar. We're going to begin something that represents for our family the miracles that God has done. And so that's what we did. We went and just got a little glass jar at like a TJ Maxx or Hobby Lobby, whatever. Got this glass jar, and we began to put in there thing after thing that represented miracles in our life. You know, for Elijah and I, whenever I guess we had been married a year maybe, and I went to the Dominican Republic on a missions trip, and they flew me home and told Elijah, listen, she has so much infection, get her on the next flight here. We need to take her into surgery immediately. And so we get there, we get to Chicago. My dad drives us back to Kansas City through the night. We walk into the doors at like 5, 6 a.m. My surgeon meets us, and he looks at Elijah and he says, sir, I'm going to need you to say goodbye to your wife because I don't think she's going to make it out of this surgery. And we're like, like, oh my goodness, what just happened? And it was this thing, and at that time, they actually had to do surgery like every other day. They took 5 liters of infection out of my body, and they said it was by a miracle of God that had not gone septic into my body because of the amount of infection that I had in my back. And I remember that moment, and Elijah cut the hospital band like a few months later when we're finally in and out. Elijah cut the hospital band and put it in our manna jar because it was a story. It was a miracle of God. It was something that we could share with our kids, with our friends that come over to our house. We could share with them what God had done in our lives. And let me just tell you, God wants to use your story to encourage others just as much as he used others to speak into your story. And I love it because we have this big manna jar now in our house, and it kind of looks like a bunch of just junk thrown into a jar, and people come over, they're like, wow, that's, our house is all like, I'm very monochromatic, so it's black, white, gray, and a little pop of gold. And then you have this big glass jar of just junk, and people are like, wow, that is Wow. And we're like, no. Let us tell you about that. Let us tell you what God's done. Because it begins to open doors. And as we share our faith, other people's faith is able to be built. And so God's given you in your hand what you need, but you have to watch who you surround yourself with, who's speaking into your dream, who's speaking into your future, and how are you speaking into the future and the dreams of those around you. Parents, I would challenge you, how are you speaking into the dreams of your kids? I said this on Mother's Day when I spoke. I'm grateful for parents that spoke into my dreams, and they were crazy. I have been all over the board in full transparency. I thought I was going to go be an attorney, and I wanted to be a sports agent because I wanted to negotiate contracts, and man, my dreams were all over the place. But I had parents that said, yeah, you can do that. Yeah, go for it. Okay, what do you need? You need us to fly across and look at a college? Let's do that. They spoke life into those dreams. I encourage you to speak life into those that God's put around you and get people who speak life into you. And the third scene that I want to show you from Hidden Figures today is at the very end of the movie. It's near the end, and Catherine, who we saw as a child, she wants to go, she's figuring all this math, and they're getting ready to launch a rocket because she's at NASA, and so they're going to launch someone, the first astronaut, into orbit, right? And it's in the midst of the space race right between the United States and Russia, and so Russia is able to put something into space, and now the United States has to do this, and then Russia has to do that, and so we're in this space race, if you will. And Catherine is figuring the math with only weeks away from the launch. And that's where we're going to pick up this scene. If you'll turn your eyes to the screen and watch this. Number 1, what's in your hand? Number 2, who's around you? And number 3, where are you going? Catherine was faithful with what had been placed in her hand. For her, it was math. It was a piece of chalk. It was very different than what's been placed in my hand. My hand, I guess, would probably be organization. I love those kinds of things. I love people. I love partnering with people. I love those kinds of things. But what's been placed in your hand will take you somewhere if you're faithful with it. You know, as we keep going through the story of Moses, I want to jump ahead to Numbers. And in Numbers chapter 20, verse 8, it says, take the staff, and this is God talking to Moses, to provide water for the Israelites. Now, they need water, and so God's instructing him. He said, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. You know, Moses had the right tool in his hand, and God had given him a commandment. He had used his staff to perform miracle after miracle. And at this moment, God said, now I want you to speak to the rock, and water will come from it. But out of anger, out of frustration, I mean, I kind of can relate with Moses, like I might be a little frustrated too. But out of anger and frustration, he took what was in his hand and struck the rock instead of speaking to it. That act of disobedience, it wasn't that he didn't hear God. It wasn't anything like that. It was a direct disobedience with what had been placed in his hand. And with that direct disobedience, it cost Moses from leading his people into the promised land. You see, at this time, like I said, the Israelites had been leaving captivity and entering into the promised land. But because of an act of disobedience, he wasn't able to go where he was headed. He wasn't able to enter the place that God had set for them to enter. And you know, I think it's so key to us. Man, God challenged me so strongly this week that what God has placed in our hand, what he's given us, who he's put us in the midst of, he's calling us somewhere. Each of us, each individual person in here has been called somewhere, has been called to do something, and God has equipped us in our hand with what we need. So I wonder what would happen if as a church we came together and said, okay, I know what's been put in my hand. You know what's been put in your hand. You know what's been put in your hand. Now, what if we're faithful with what God's put in our hands? What kind of provision would we see? What kind of life change? What kind of freedom would we see? What kind of miracles would we see? You know, it wasn't Moses' staff that did the miracles. It was an ordinary object. For Catherine, it was an ordinary object. She was given a piece of chalk. But that ordinary object placed in the hands of the right person can change the course of history as we know it. And I think the same thing for us. What you have in your hand can change the course of history as we know it. It can change the next generation. It can change the business and financial world. It can change creative and music fields. It can change medical fields. It can change anything if we're faithful with what God's put in our hands. And I want to pray today as the worship team plays. I want to pray for us that God would begin to speak to us what he's placed in our hand. I think sometimes we look at other people. I don't know if you ever do this, but you look and you're like, well, of course she can do this. I mean, she's a genius, right? Like she can do anything. Or, well, yeah, him. I mean, he's been given connections and open doors. So like, yeah, he can do this. And we begin to excuse away what God's called us to do simply because we don't take hold of what God wants to speak to us, to you, to me. And so as the worship team plays and Lily begins to sing, if you would stand with me as we close, and if you would just close your eyes, if you feel comfortable to raise your hands, and would you just ask God a simple question? Say, God, what's in my hand? God, what have you given to me? I believe God's going to speak with fresh revelation in this time. If you're tuning in online, God wants to speak to you where you're at, what he's given you, what he's placed in your hand. Who's around you? Who are you with? Can you allow God to begin to challenge you? Who are you allowing to speak into your life that maybe shouldn't? Whose life do you need to speak into that maybe you aren't? What does God want to do with your story? And I would challenge you to ask God, God, where am I going? Where are you leading? Elijah and I pray all the time, God, if your presence doesn't go before us, don't send us up from this place. It's exactly what Moses prayed. He said, God, if you don't go before us, don't even send us up. Can you take this moment and just say, God, where am I going? If it's not led by God, it won't be what you planned. It won't be what you think it's going to be. It may look like a good job, but it might not be a God job. It might look like a good opportunity and not be a God opportunity if he doesn't lead that. And I believe today he wants to speak into us.